Sabrina 70s comic, issue 76. We start out with some girl breaking the fourth wall, saying that there's something wrong with the girl being named Rose, Violet, or Iris where she comes from because it reminds her of her past. There's a continuity error, as Sabrina says that she thought all witches rode on broomsticks when it's been established multiple times that motorcycles and vacuums are other options, and are popular with younger witches. It turns out witches don't ride brooms in this girl's advanced civilization, as she'll soon discover. This is interesting, but it's also starting me out attached, making it less interesting, because it comes out of nowhere for the comic, and I don't know this character. Oh, the next panel explains how these two met. Then we should have had this confusing panel be the first one. It's good that we'll get to see that advanced civilization of witches because it's world building the universe. But logically, you'd think that every civilization of witches would be advanced, because magic could power technology. But of course, there's a lot of technology that magic would make useless, like planes, and cars, because they have teleportation, and flying. But again, witches don't always have magic. Sometimes they deplete their magic, so cars would still be useful. This is so unlike the comic that it's forgettable. Anyways, maybe the civilization is ancient because its first settlers were witches whose powers were taken away, so they had to focus on technology to compensate? So we see a book on birds fall on the floor, as pretentious narration speaks about it with overly flowery vocabulary, which gets you to hate the narration, and not want to read it at all. That's a shame, because it's important to read it to understand what's going on in a series of still images. Basically, the book's pages got moved by a breeze until they got to a chapter on the passenger pigeon. Sabrina's genre savvy enough by this point to get suspicious of this, so she reads a book about it, where she's told that as late as the last century, the passenger pigeon was so common that millions of them made up a flock thick enough to blot out the sun, and they ended up being hunted to extinction. Sabrina feels upset that there's so many endangered species. Then the woman from the first panel flies into her open window on a vacuum cleaner. Sabrina's told that in this woman's dimension, the witches have the most modern things and brooms are obsolete. Why aren't all the witches like that, logically? This is the standard for witches in the sitcom. She fortunately apologizes for intruding and says that she took a wrong turn at an astral intersection that was poorly marked. That's supposed to be the explanation for why she flew into Sabrina's house? That's not getting me invested in the story. That's too stupid. What's an astral intersection? The woman asks where her robot servants are, and irritates Sabrina from calling her house dingy. She's called primitive, and somehow, she liked Sabrina's style when she was mad at her. I expected Sabrina to explain why they gave up on robots. Then she could be called out on giving up on the robots after they each made one mistake because they weren't given clear enough instructions. Sabrina agrees to go visit her dimension. Am I actually supposed to believe that this woman would have the name L24? No one would go by names like that. Seneca 9009's name was better. They land in a corner of their newest museum, and everyone's looking at their latest and most valuable exhibit, a pine tree that barely has any pines. Here we go. I refuse to believe that their world wouldn't have grass in it, and they'd have the grass be a part of an exhibit. This whole no grass in a future thing was clearly stolen from the Jetsons, and it was stupid there too, because grass has been extremely common on the planet for a ridiculously long time. People like being around nature. It was actually proven to be good for a human being's well-being, so this is hard to take seriously. Grass and trees wouldn't be removed. People are planting a ridiculous amount of trees in all sorts of countries at this point to combat pollution, and that's just on Earth. It's impossible to believe that any planet with people on it would have a future without greenery. Like, renewable energy sources are actually a lot better than they used to be. The woman brags to Sabrina that because she was in the expedition that found the pine tree, she was awarded a Class 9 ration card. Sabrina somehow doesn't ask what she means by ration card, and instead congratulates her by saying a phrase that confuses her. The woman doesn't know what a feather or bird is. I guess I can't believe that because she lives on an alien planet. So, it never had birds to begin with. If the intent was they went extinct, that's extremely impossible to buy. Chickens have feathers. We'd never let chickens go extinct. Her meeting Sabrina is way too forced for me to take this story seriously. It came out of complete nowhere for a story that's totally different from the rest of them. Sabrina steps outside and sees nothing but concrete and steel and not even an ant. She tells Elle to go back to her world and shows her the grass outside of her house. And as I expected from my knowledge of the Jetsons, they used to have grass in her world, but they destroyed it. Bullshit. Why haven't we been told what the name of her dimension is? That makes it harder to get invested in and take it seriously. Sabrina gives her flower seeds, which she thinks are food at first, and says that she's not hungry while suspiciously stammering. The writer should have known that no one would change their mind and things wouldn't become better just because someone read the story. Sabrina says that they're hailed as flower seeds. She says that her people will be grateful. What if they don't know how to take care of the flowers? The story just ends there with her flying out of Sabrina's window. So wait, is that why she had that spiel to the audience about women with the names Rose and Violet, reminding them of their past? I thought she meant that women with those names personally had tragic pasts, and they escaped them to have normal lives. She should have said, the past of her civilization. I guess the reason this story was written was to have a nature-preserving message, but it goes too over the top with it to be taken seriously by anybody. Nobody but the most easily worried people would think that there was any kind of chance of grass going extinct just because technology is a thing. There's a reason we still have parks and forests for the sake of it. I don't see why that would ever change. Not to mention this comic was made with technology, so that's ungrateful. In the next story, Sabrina sadly watches the news on TV, where a reporter overwhelms me with so much dialogue that the only reason I read all of it was that I respect this comic, aside from Dell existing. There's a report from the southern border that swarms of killer bees are invading the country, and somehow the only deterrent ever is the loud playing of a specific song. What, there's no anti-bee spray? Wouldn't pesticides work? How would it be a specific song? I think he was paid to lie about that to promote the song. But what kind of a world is that, if that's allowed on the news? Too bad Della forbids witches from doing good deeds, because a witch could easily cause this to not be a problem anymore. Then he says that hundreds of mice, each with a tiny atomic bomb strapped to his body, are being smuggled into the country aboard a freighter, and they squeak by the guarded ports. So Sabrina wonders what else could go wrong. That news sounds ridiculously dark, and completely out of place as a result. Wouldn't the country be guaranteed an apocalypse that way? He's not even explaining where the invading mice come from. Is that country ignoring the Geneva Conventions? You'd think the witches living on Earth would insist on doing something about this by zapping away every mouse they can, luring mice to places with bait or a spell, because they'd want to preserve their own lives without having to go move somewhere else. So things should be fine, and that should be the explanation. Della would tell the witches to do that. At least the news is different from what our news would be like, by being unrealistic. Then the doorbell rings, and Sabrina's asked to sign for a box of titter splitters. She doesn't know what those are, and she's told that they're from Dr. Soon Poon's multi-dimensional export enterprises. That doctor was the guy who made that tiny submarine the Atlantean had in an earlier story. What's that? There's actual continuity now? What took so long? The comic's almost over. He opens the box, and she thinks the little creature hopping out of it is cute. How'd it survive in that box? She says that makes her want to laugh, and they're all about happiness. He says he's got to deliver 7 mini-subs to Atlantis. It'd be interesting if I got to see Hilda or Ambrose's reaction to this, since they didn't see Atlantis. But nope. Sabrina sees that there's a ton of these splitters, and she starts laughing with them because the laughter's infectious, and tells them to cool it with the duplication. Why doesn't she cast a spell to make all of them go away immediately except for one, and get rid of their ability to duplicate themselves? Were they intentionally sent to her to terrorize her? But why? She did something nice for that Atlantean. She didn't do anything that would inconvenience someone, unless that woman was actually trying to overthrow her government. Somehow, when Sabrina casts a spell about getting them back to the next dimension, she doesn't get rid of all of them at once, when I'm sure she could imagine that just fine. No genuine tension. The writer has to force things for there to be drama. She ends up all zapped out and having to hide in the attic. How would she not just get rid of them all at once? This is impossible to take seriously. This is an omnipotent witch. She said she could reverse time by a day in one story. Why doesn't she just go back in time and teleport the crate away? Well, before she ran out of magic. It should have been foreshadowed that she was close to running out of magic. That should be the case every time. Her exhausting all of her magic could be a believable way to have tension. The story would have made a bit more sense if all of the splitters were immune to magic. She turns to her magic mirror and tells it to return the delivery boy to her. Why does the mirror say that she's really gonna owe him for this one? Actually, wouldn't it be impossible because he's never seen the delivery boy, so he wouldn't know what he looks like? Maybe the magic mirror has access to any knowledge ever, or can at least tap into her brainwaves. If Sabrina could just get this mirror's help when it was in the attic for no reason when it wasn't the last time, it feels like a deus ex machina. It makes the story seem like it was just padded out for no reason, and that's the only reason she couldn't just get rid of all the splitters at once. The delivery boy says that he was just coming back, and he delivered those things here by mistake. He plays a whistle, and they're all reduced to one splitter that's back in the box. He explains that he had checked with Dr. Soonpoon, and he said she really needs splitters on this planet. What made him think Sabrina would like being forced to laugh? And what made him think making a being that duplicates itself infinitely would be a remotely good idea? He's both evil and a moron. They could completely overpopulate their planet and ruin it and starve to death. This doctor sounds like he doesn't think anything through. Sabrina calls her laughter from them phony happiness. I guess that proves that she was being forced to laugh with magic. Sabrina says that the people on Earth's happiness will come when they start solving their problems, and they can't just forget about them and laugh all day. So doesn't that mean that Dr. Soonpoon's society is horrible because most people just laugh instead of solving problems? The delivery boy shouldn't have needed Sabrina to explain to him after the fact that she wouldn't have wanted to be forced to laugh just because her world sucked. I can imagine there'd still be people in his society trying to solve problems because not everyone has the same personality as everyone else, even if most people somehow are fine with splitters forcing them to laugh. I thought Sabrina was given a creature by a bad guy intentionally to spite her. Even when I was reading out the script, I thought that. The story ends with her casually agreeing to go on a date with him and go to a drive-in, even though she already has a boyfriend she's clinging of. Yet another thing that the 90s comic accidentally took from it. In the next story, Sabrina hears the booming of thunder when there wasn't a cloud in the sky 10 minutes ago. Della arrives through Sabrina's window, saying that she took the express thunderhead over here when she heard the bad news. Why would she take the express anything when she can teleport and she's teleported here with no fancy dramatic entrance every other time? She reveals that someone named Professor Pither has ended his exile and is going to return to Earth. Sabrina fails as an audience surrogate by immediately knowing that he's from Pluto, rather than asking why he was able to end his own exile, or thought he'd be allowed to get away with it. It's stilted of her dialogue to say, "as you know." She should have had to explain this for Sabrina. It turns out Pither is always looking for money to finance his plan to dominate the world. If Della thinks him ending his exile is bad news, why didn't she, or any other witch, just kill him with her magic in a second, or effortlessly teleport him to them and turn him into a frog at the very least? Salem was turned into a cat in the 90s sitcom for that very same reason. This comic is more dark than that, and Della doesn't have the guts to do that. It better be explained in the story that he's enchanted himself so that he's immune to magic. But even then, any witch could just stab him in the back, magic immunity or not. It's impossible to believe the witches wouldn't have dealt with this guy already. It turns out that no reputable company would buy Pither's antacid tablet formula, so he couldn't handle it. And a spy told Della that unless... Wait, why didn't he brainwash someone to agreeing to get it? I guess he took offense to it, and he wanted them to want to buy it, because his pride was at stake. And a spy told Della that unless the Riverdale Chamber of Commerce would pay Pither money, he's threatened to ruin the Riverdale Regatta tomorrow. Good thing Hilda explains that the regatta is the annual sailboat race on Lake Flaky. I assumed she was talking about a dam, and that it'd be a plan to flood the town. It's stilted that Hilda explains that the regatta is what it is, in the way she does. Sabrina should have asked what the Riverdale Regatta was, and then she'd have to be told what it is naturally. We've seen witches zap up money multiple times, especially earlier in the comic, so there's no way Pither wouldn't just zap up money himself. I hope there's a good explanation for why not Dr. Eggman is targeting a place in Riverdale specifically, because it seems to only happen because Sabrina's the main character. So many plot holes. I have to assume now that Pither's powers were taken away a long time ago. And that's why he hasn't effortlessly conquered the world by now by brainwashing, or threatening with magic. Why does Hilda, the stereotypical witch who doesn't care about mortals, think he'd be a fiend for threatening the sailboat race on a lake with a name that's bad marketing? Della wanted to put Sabrina on trial for caring about frivolous mortal things. It's kind of weird that Della even cares about this. Della says that she heard that the security around the lake tomorrow will be very tight. Every precaution has been taken. I guess by security, she actually means invisible witch guards. Della says that if Sabrina can handle Pither, it'll be a big step up the ladder for her. Oh yeah, for all of 2 seconds before she does something good with her magic again, so no one should care. Why did she even ask Sabrina in the first place, instead of thinking she could do it herself because she's the head witch? Why did it even bother creating antacid tablets in the first place? Why do you think anyone would buy his when obviously not only would he have a bad reputation, but he'd also have to be competing with other tablets that were already invented? I never buy that he'd be the first witch to make them for witches, because obviously witches would be ahead of mortals in technology because magic would make getting food so easy for witches right from the start that it'd free up their time and allow them to start doing things besides just hunting, gathering, and farming, which would lead to technology being researched and developed in general much earlier. It would have made sense if he created his antacid pills on Earth. If he was the first one to sell them there, he would have gotten rich just fine. Also, how would anyone remember he's trying to conquer the world if witches can erase memories? Once you erase the incriminating memories of every single witness? I guess there's been so many witnesses that he can't possibly cover it up. He just doesn't see all of the witnesses. Or his powers were taken away. Realistically, Sabrina is scared of the idea that she'd be put up against Pither. How is he supposed to be a wily adversary? If he was really competent, he'd have taken over the world by now. If Sabrina tried to take over the world, the spy witches would immediately catch her and stop her. And I know this because it happened in the sitcom. So why is Pither any different? Oh, he really does still have his magic. Because Della says he's a shapeshifter. Then why hasn't he effortlessly replaced the American president? Or any rich guys to get their money? Well, witches would be able to figure out he wasn't the real guy, no matter who he shapeshifted into, because he wouldn't have all of his memories and knowledge, so he'd be acting differently. And only witches would be able to figure out why. So maybe he tried that and got caught and gave up. But he could just shapeshift to look like a rich guy and get money from their wallets. If he still has his powers, how is he not just effortlessly brainwashing his way to conquering the world? I can imagine he'd be stopped in that path by spy witches who would cast a spell on him. But then how is he still able to make his plans instead of already being turned into a cat by now, or worse? Maybe he doesn't have brainwashing powers, and his only magical ability is that he can assume any form. Della should say that his only power is shapeshifting, and he does it all the time because every witch can do this anyways. I guess that's what she means by the only sure way to recognize him. Maybe the Witch's Coven can take away a certain ability, like brainwashing for example, but then why would they let him keep his shapeshifting? Why wouldn't they take away all his abilities if they think he's a threat? This story seems to fall apart with every single line I'm describing of it. At least it's trying to be epic by having a big antagonist like him. Della says she's on her way to a collagen party in the 7th dimension. What a bland title. And the next day, Zelda's surprised that Sabrina isn't coming with her to the lake. She says that something tells her it's time to pick up her little cousin's birthday gift. Maybe she's scared and looking for an excuse to hide. She says she'll meet them at the lake, and Hilda tells Zelda to stop protesting and let her go and do what she wants. I guess Della's too busy to be told by a spy witch that Sabrina's defying her. Why is Hilda telling Zelda to just let Sabrina go when she'd get in trouble with Della for this? Sabrina goes to a shop to see what gift she could buy for her cousin. So this cousin we've only just heard of now is someone that Sabrina's just blindly shopping for, instead of buying a specific item she was told to buy. It turns out some guy just bought out the shop's entire stock of model planes, and he had the fragrance of fish. This was supposed to be the calling card of the shapeshifter villain. I wanted to mention it earlier, but how stupid does he have to be to always use a specific cologne when he's trying to disguise himself all the time? So even police dogs have been trained to detect the odor. Sabrina explains that he's going to use model planes. Hilda says there's security from here almost all the way to Bongo Bay, and beneath the surface of that bay is a submarine, where the shockingly ridiculous-looking Professor Pither is. I was imagining someone skinny. Why does he have to be drawn with his tongue sticking out? I already stopped taking it seriously. I can only assume that he's been made to speak with a speech impediment as a failed attempt at a joke. At least him being a surprise comedy character is trying to make up for how seriously he's been taken for no reason. It turns out he's even more like Eggman than I thought because of his round appearance. He's more like Morpho with his shapeshifting. He wants to make Lake Flaky a thing of the past. I assume he only has shapeshifting powers, because otherwise you'd think he'd just point to the lake and make it disappear. Also, another witch would then undo that spell in a heartbeat. Why does he think he has any kind of chance? Why did it take until this story for a story to continue on to the next story? You'd think if his goal is to make money and he wants to drain the lake, then his goal would be to drain the lake and sell bottled water of it. Privatize the water, like Eggman tried to do. He says that each model plane is carrying a load of his antacid pills, which absorb the moisture of the lake and make the sailboats get stuck in the mass. Zelda feels like keeling over, but I'm just wondering why these witches don't instantly point at and destroy the model planes, and also return the lake to normal right away. Sure, that's revealing magic, but that happens all the time with no consequences. So I'm sure there won't be any consequences for this either, and these witches should know that. Everyone would just be made to forget it. So why is Zelda just being useless and feeling like fainting, instead of pointing and summoning a giant swarm of bees to defeat the model planes? How is she just acting like a weak old lady? They're all omnipotent goddesses, one of whom reversed time. The model plane starts leaving. A cop shoots, and the model plane keeps gliding with its gas line punctured. At least it's creative that he relied on a model plane. Sabrina says that a piece of her headband wrapped around the gas line should do it, as the plane goes over to her. Then she uses magic to shrink herself down in secret. The radio controls seem to be working, and she flies over to his submarine as I wonder why his plan wasn't effortlessly stopped by Della by now. This not Dr. Eggman wants to spell the end of the Riverdale Regatta, but shouldn't he realize that people would have sailboat races in other places too? Sabrina flies her plane towards the submarine and sees pills in a valve. She returns to normal size and Pither sees her. He asks who she is and tells her to get away from that sea lock. I immediately wonder why she doesn't just use magic to freeze him in time to make him unable to do anything against her. She turns a wheel and makes a sea of pills expand. And he gets to hide in a tower because she didn't just freeze him in a giant ice cube. So she says she's gonna zap this hatch off his hinges and bring him to justice. At least the pills are being used in a creative way. Why didn't any of the other witches get the idea to at least summon model planes and fly over to him to do this? How is the dumb blonde the only one who's doing this? It's only because she's the main character. Hilda and Zelda are main characters too. You think they'd do something. But they'd have nothing to do here. Other than, keep the professor from escaping. So the professor escapes the submarine in a rocket, and Sabrina stands there like a dumb drooling moron being too stupid to just stop him in a single point. See, this is why Sabrina could never actually work trying to be a tense action series like Sonic does. It's almost impossible for it to have good writing that way. The whole time I'm wondering why the villain didn't get stopped immediately after being faced with someone so powerful. It's like the Silver Arc in the reboot, except better. It's impossible for me to take it seriously that he's saying there's a witch in his path for world conquest, because I'm too busy wondering why Sabrina's doing nothing to stop him. Like freezing his machine in time. He obviously wouldn't be able to escape. Why is she swimming away instead of flying after him? Della says that she let him get away. So if the writer knew this, why on earth did he write it? Why doesn't Della go after him? Sabrina lampshades that she should have zapped first and spoken later. That's just what I was thinking. Even then, she still had plenty of time to stop him from escaping. Why did she even swim at all instead of just teleporting back to Zelda? Why didn't she teleport his rocket thing to the sailboat races can continue. Wait, how did the lake get back anyways? I guess Hilda and Zelda did it. They should have said so. The story ends with a sequel hook as not Eggman flies away in a rocket escape pod that a witch didn't go after with her broom for some reason, and wants revenge against Sabrina. She shouldn't have told him her name. You'd think that with all the witches near the lake, at least one of them would have cast a spell to stop his rocket from flying away. We didn't need him to still be able to do stuff at the end of the story. The next issue won't have him in it. I'm just wondering how Dell is so incompetent that he's still alive when Salem got turned into a cat effortlessly in the sitcom. That was much better writing because it was a case of reality ensues in a world with spy witches in it. You'd think this story with the world-conquering villain would have been the last issue in the comic. It seems to me like they ran out of normal Sabrina story ideas a couple issues ago. Maybe there's a lot more issues and the site just doesn't have all of them. The first story is about a vacuum riding witch and having a completely nonsensical explanation for how she met her. It was impossible for me to take the story seriously because the first panel showed me her riding away with Sabrina out of nowhere, which is not a natural introduction, and her meeting her was completely forced. The story steals the idea of there being no grass in a futuristic society from the Jetsons, and it was impossible to believe. And Sabrina didn't cast a single spell the whole story. So what was the point of having the story? The protagonist could have been anybody. This redhead didn't cast any spells either. She didn't need to say she was a witch, considering the lack of magic. She could have been an alien for all the difference it made to this story. If the only point of the story was a pro-nature message, that was pointless. No one's gonna actually believe that if we keep going on this path, grass would go extinct. The second story is about Sabrina getting some laughing little monsters delivered to her out of nowhere by the guy who made that tiny submarine in an earlier story. But how stupid was he to think that he should make them duplicate themselves? And to think that anyone would be fine with being forced to laugh? No one would be. He would have been sued and fired. This wouldn't have been a creation that'd be allowed to go public. And yet, he wasn't actually trying to inconvenience her, forgettably, and was just trying to cheer her up because he read about how bad Earth is. I wish the first page actually showed us a picture to go along with the news being described in those two panels, because it was really boring and hard to motivate myself to read all of that text. Since when does a Sabrina comic do this? And it was impossible for me to take seriously that Sabrina couldn't just zap away all of the splitters at once right away. Since she got help from magic anyways, it seemed to only be an excuse to make the story last longer by forcing her to rely on a mirror to get the delivery boy back here, who was on his way here anyways because he delivered the splitters here by mistake. But why? I thought they were intentionally sent to Sabrina by Dr. Soonpoon to help her. Were they delivered to her by mistake or not? And the final story showcases why Dr. Eggman would be impossible to take seriously in the Sabrina series. I kept waiting for a proper explanation for why he wasn't turned into a frog or killed by the many witches who hate him, and I never got one. The whole story didn't make sense to have happened as a result. If Della hates him, he'd already be gone. His advantage is that he keeps shapeshifting, so witches won't be able to imagine him and warp to him, but he's stupid enough to always have the same aftershave follow him around. Sabrina didn't even need to find out he bought all those model planes, because Hilda saw them at the same time she did. Why was Sabrina the only one who did anything to stop him? Wouldn't all those other witches have gotten the idea to summon up model planes and telepathically fly them to his submarine with the other ones? I do find it creative what his exact plan was. I guess the idea is that he could intimidate countries into making him the ruler by showing that he could do that and he'd never be found. Okay, but the thing is, world leaders don't make deals with terrorists like him. It's been proven with dedicated research that this kind of thing doesn't work, and that's part of why. He wants money, but he could just zap it up. Also, sure, Pluto is lifeless and not an actual planet, but I forgave it and let it slide because I assumed that she wasn't talking about our Pluto, and instead about another realm Pluto that would be terraformed to make it inhabitable. But this should have been explained in the story. The point is, while it was kinda epic on the surface that Sabrina stopped this villain's evil plan, Sabrina only looked cool for a couple of panels before she was forced to be a complete idiot just so that he could escape. I couldn't take the story seriously at all when this guy made an enemy out of witches. So they would have zapped him a long time ago. Clearly his shapeshifting can only get him so far if witches were still able to find out it was him and what his plan was. At least he was portrayed in a goofy way, after he was still taken too seriously the whole story. One of the biggest problems with the story is that Della overwhelms us with a huge amount of text in a talking head scene. It's one giant exposition dump out of nowhere. It wouldn't be quite so bad if her exposition was illustrated showing us what she meant, and her text was simply text boxes on the top of those pictures. It got me bored, and it was easy to nitpick all that dialogue too. Like, why did you say dominate this world, including the Falkland Islands? Of course they're included, they're part of this world. It's not funny. And if they're never going to be used and mentioned again, what's the point of referencing them in particular? Is Riverdale on one of those islands? Did the story really need 2 entire pages of exposition? Couldn't we have been first introduced to not Eggman when he first sent the planes after the lake? Sure, it'd be sudden, but it came out of nowhere anyways because this story was the first time we ever heard of him. And Sabrina already knew about him. The point is, Sabrina and the other witches are so powerful that I was just confused that the professor was still able to be a threat when they're aware of him ahead of time. It was just so distracting that the only reason Sabrina was the only person who did anything to stop him was that she's the main character. It should have been explained that he had a shape-shifting magical artifact, and it was to compensate for the fact that Dell took all of his powers away. Because he'd have an infinite amount of powers if he's a warlock, so he would have already taken over the world by now. This might have been the most poorly written story in the whole comic, at least in terms of plot holes. I think it's interesting enough. I'm sure there are a lot of stories in the comic that are more aggravating.